My name is Katie. Thanks for joining us tonight with the Let's Talk About Hemingway, presented by KEET in partnership with Word Humboldt and the Humboldt County Library. This is a screening and a discussion which will be led by HSU Assistant English Professor Dr. Janelle Adsit. Sorry, Janelle. Her panel of educators and authors have much to discuss about Hemingway tonight, and hopefully you've had a chance to see the Ken Burns and Lynn Novick series. If you haven't, that's okay. It's still streaming. You can get it for free, streaming it from now until April 26th. The other great thing to watch is Conversations on Hemingway. They're still posted. I checked today, and there are 9 one-hour films with the filmmakers and other guests covering specific topics about Hemingway. And I'm going to go through a few things here before we get started. And we're going to start first with the films. And there's just a couple of films, and then we're going to go to the conversation, which is going to be fun. KEET and the Humboldt County Library are accepting poems from the workshops that we presented with Word Humboldt. And this includes poetry from the first workshop we did, Blackout and Found Poetry. If you weren't in the workshop and you want to do it, you still can. We've got like another month to collect poems, and I'm collecting poems, and so is Corinne at the Humboldt County Library. It's centered around Hemingway. And actually, you could do a poem based on the themes of Hemingway, too. And you can find the themes online. There's a few of them, including mental health, the natural world, manly men, etc. So feel free to be that. We're collecting them, and we're going to make a book if we get enough poems that will live at the library. And if we have enough money left over from our grant, we will have it available for people as well. Another thing that you should know is probably tomorrow, I'll be sending out a survey from PBS. Because we received a grant to promote the series Hemingway, they ask that you fill out the survey. It's really simple. It might take you a couple of minutes. You just click through. And then there's the link, I think it's at the top of the page, to send it to PBS directly. Then they'll get it. A couple of things about OV. So on OV, David is monitoring the chat right now. It says my name, but it's actually David. So David's our chat guy. And the chat, I think, is on this side. And that's where you can ask questions. And we highly encourage you to ask questions of the panel. If you have a problem, here's another thing. If you have a problem with OV, which I often do when I go to watch panel discussions, the reset button, refresh button at the top, click on that. If that doesn't work, I actually click on the screen too. And I think that's about it. So I hope you stay tuned. Don't go anywhere. And again, the films are about 14 minutes. There's 2 of them. Oh, that's the other thing. There's 2 clips we're using. So there will be a little break in between. Just sit there, just wait. And then the next film will start. And after the 2 films, we'll have our panel discussion. And Janelle will lead that. So do stay tuned. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
I'm Janelle Adsit, and I want to thank you all for joining us. It's great to see a live audience here with us. I'd also like to thank KEET-TV for hosting this conversation space. Thanks to Katie Whiteside for setting up this time, and to Katie and David Thompson for all the behind the scenes work in offering multiple events that give audiences space to process, connect with, and respond to the film Hemingway. Our conversation today will focus on what it means to turn to Hemingway as an author in our present moment. Ken Burns and Lynn Novick's films have pressed into the lore of US history and how history is intricately stitched into the present. This is a complicated matter. And as we approach the following conversation, I want to acknowledge that this program is coming to you from where KEET-TV is located, the present and ancestral homeland and unceded territory of the Wiyot tribe. It is important to acknowledge that any discussion of US history takes place in the context of continued colonialism, and we acknowledge that the US was built on the labor also of enslaved people and is continually characterized by multiple forms of oppression. Our conversation is contextualized by the continued contribution of their survivors, including robust contributions to the literary arts. Our national and global history is vexed and complex. As Lynn Novick has said in interviews about the film, we are living in times when we are reevaluating all the icons from the past, and along with them, the stories that are told about US and global history as those icons represent those stories. So thank you again for being here for this conversation. And I'd like to now introduce our panelists with much gratitude for you each for being here today. Eric Bennett is the author of the book Workshops of Empire, Stegner, Engel, and American Creative Writing During the Cold War. This was published in 2015, along with a novel, A Big Enough Lie, also published in 2015. The novel is about the Iraq War and publishing scandals, and Eric's scholarship centers on the role the early Cold War played in establishing the norms and practices of creative writing programs since the mid-century. Eric holds an MFA in fiction from the University of Iowa and a PhD in English from Harvard University. He's a professor of English and the director of American Studies at Providence College in Rhode Island. Reginald Edmonds is a poet, activist, and educator based out of Richmond, California. Reggie is the 2019 Berkeley Poetry Slam champion, the Poetry Battles Game 5 champion, and runs both the Rich Oak Alchemy Slam and the Oakland Poetry Slam and Wide Open Mic. They have 2 self-published chapbooks published in 2017 and 2018, which I hope you'll all check out. Ann Putnam has taught creative writing, gender studies, and Hemingway at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington for many years. She's published short stories, essays, and book reviews, and most recently a memoir titled Full Moon at Noontide, A Daughter's Last Goodbye, published by the University of Iowa Press. Anne has made 6 trips to Cuba and has recently completed Cuban Quarter Moon, a novel in which Hemingway appears. Max Pinigis is a 6th grade language arts teacher in Baltimore. He's an alumnus of Humboldt State University, a writer, and a longtime reader of Hemingway. So it's wonderful to have this group here. Thank you. Welcome all. So Hemingway has more written about him than he himself wrote. We come to this conversation with different orientations toward Hemingway and the conversations that surround his work. Our goal here is not to reaffirm a particular author-hero myth, but instead, I know you each have very nuanced answers to the question, what did it mean to you to first read Hemingway? And if you have remained interested in his work, what has kept you interested in Hemingway? Or has Hemingway been a gateway to something else for you? I hope we can each say something about this question, but Max, would you want to start?
Yes, thank you, Janelle. Thank you to PBS KEET-TV for hosting this. Really excited to talk about one of my favorite authors. One of the advertisements that went out for this was next to my name said teacher and loves Hemingway. I think it's a pretty apt description of where I'm coming from with Hemingway. I wrote a paper in undergrad that was called In Defense of Hemingway. But I'll sort of just have a little story here of how I kind of found him in school. So I was at Humboldt State University, and I was an English major, and I wasn't really connecting to any literature per se. And I remember I was in a bookstore. I was just looking around, and I've heard Hemingway's name a million times, never read anything that he had written. So I just picked up A Farewell to Arms. I liked the cover. Bought it, took it home. And as soon as I read it, I was really struck by the way it was written. I had never read something with that sort of rhythm and plotting and the word choice. It just kind of struck me as so unique and almost hard to read in a way. But once I got used to it, I sort of really enjoyed it. I remember a moment where there was some dialogue between, I believe, the 2 main characters. And that was the first time in a book that I really felt like these characters were real. They were real people talking, and that struck me. And that moment, I knew that there was something special in this book. I kept reading, and I just remember towards the end of the book, as it sort of gets into the climax, that I felt like I was floating while reading this book. And we've not read Farewell to Arms, but I think it's probably, the end is sadder than any story has any right to be. And it really stuck with me just how deeply I felt the emotions, I think, that Hemingway was trying to put in that book. And it made me want to read everything that he had really written at that point, just because of the effect it had on my emotions. And so that moment and moments thereafter that I've read Hemingway, I sort of just, from my perspective, and I do know that everyone has their own opinion on him as a man, as an author. And for me, it's just Hemingway speaks to anyone, I feel like, who's felt loneliness, felt heartache, struggled with this, ever elusive understanding of just what it means to be human. And for me, I note the flaws of Hemingway, but I also see him as flawed as any human is. We just kind of look at him closer than most others. So yeah, I think that's what my approach to Hemingway and my relationship and how it sort of started and continues to be.
Nice.
Janelle, if you'll let me, I'd like to go next for two reasons. One is that I wish I had had Max as my teacher in high school, because when I first encountered Hemingway in high school, I remember it vividly. It appeared in a textbook, anthologized literature, and on the opposing page, there was a Winslow Homer watercolor that was just beautiful and inviting, and it was a wilderness picture of a guy fishing, and I thought, this is going to be the most amazing story ever. And I read the story and nothing happened. And it didn't please me at all. I wasn't much of a reader then, and I really could have used somebody like Max to have opened up the text for me. The other reason I wanted to jump in and go next is that Farewell to Arms was also my gateway to appreciating Hemingway, but it took an expert to help me in. And I had a professor in college named Philip Fisher. And I remember when he lectured about A Farewell to Arms, he made what's going to sound like a very technical point about it, but it just blew my mind. He observed that Hemingway built his sentences around the word and. And the fancy name for that is a paratactic sentence. Hemingway used parataxis, meaning linking everything with and, instead of linking things with however, if, although, but. When you use that second set of words, you're getting philosophical about the world, and you're suggesting that you can think about it and put it into some sort of meaningful order. And that Hemingway, in A Farewell to Arms, by using and all the time, was suggesting we can't order this logically or philosophically. However is too philosophical, although is too orderly. And this mess of a world only deserves that word and. All you can do is look at discrete things and link them together with the simplest word. And when the professor showed me that philosophical dimension of the text, I thought, boy, that's amazing. And how well it went with the kind of carnage of World War I and the dissolution of a European order. So I was a convert then, but I wish I had been a little sooner.
Reggie, would you want to share your story?
Yeah, thank you so much, Janelle. Hemingway, for me, to be completely honest, was the start of my falling out with academia. Because here was this writer who is so prolific and who I can recognize technically is a damn good writer, but holds such offensive views that it became a barrier. And it wasn't until I started approaching his work from heavy critique, outside of academia. Because I think in academia, when I was going to school, there was such pressure to like Hemingway that there was no room to be like, he was racist, and I don't like his work because he was racist. That I honestly didn't appreciate how good of a writer he was, despite how offensive of a writer he was, until I was able to deconstruct and really get to the meat of why what he was saying was so offensive and what does that mean in the context of his viewpoints. But I think as a result of me falling out with academia and really trying to push away from reading works created by white men, I started looking into more writers of color, more poetry. I became a writer myself. So in a way, Hemingway pushed me in a good direction, even though it was a negative experience. Yeah, I think that's what I have to say about my journey with Hemingway.
Thank you, Reggie, so much. And what you just said that I hope we can circle back to as the conversation continues. Anne, would you want to share your story before we proceed?
Sure. Yeah. I didn't know anything about Hemingway until I was, I think, 19 in college. And I was taking an American Lit Survey class and was assigned, as you were probably, A Farewell to Arms. And I read the book and I had the experience that Edna O'Brien described, where I wept for about a week. I wasn't expecting that feeling. And what that book did for me was to say, I didn't know what I was doing. I was a soci major, PE major, drama major, psych major. And all of a sudden I said, I want to live my life where I can read books like this and talk about them and write about them. And that changed the course of everything that was to come. So I went on, did some other things, public school teaching, and then went to grad school at UW in Seattle, and was ready to write my dissertation on Hemingway's short stories. And I couldn't find anyone who would be on my committee. The men just said, oh, I hate Hemingway. He makes me want to punch him out. And the women said, Hemingway, you're going to write a dissertation on Hemingway. Why would you do that? And so I felt quite lonely out in the Northwest. There are not very many Hemingway scholars in this neck of the woods. But I wrote my close reading dissertation, got the degree. And then the question, what kept me going? Those magical words. I always felt like I was coming home to places I had never been. And that feeling stayed with me for the longest time. And then everything blew apart when The Garden of Eden was published. And suddenly I realized there was another pair of lenses that I could look through, and that was the lens of gender. And then that led me to thinking about how do we treat landscape. And I worked with Annette Kolodny, her work with her book, The Lay of the Land. So there we are. And then I went to Cuba in a group of scholars. We were the first ones to go to Cuba. And we had a conference where we joined Cuban scholars. And that experience changed my life also. It broke my heart. I fell in love with Cuba, and it just literally broke my heart. What was happening down there, for which our government bore great responsibility. And so I went back 5 more times and unfortunately wrote a novel that kept getting bigger and bigger each time I went down, because more things kept happening, and things that seemed to happen that I'd already written about in the book, or vice versa. And so that's been a gateway to the study of the Cuban people, the religion Santeria, I was able to have a healing ceremony conducted by a Babalao, is the chief priest of the Santeria religion. And I said, oh, please, no chicken blood, but there was. And anyway, that went into the book as well. So, and here I am, living, breathing, standing, and have never found anything that I didn't find absolutely intriguing about Hemingway. I'll add one more little tiny aside. The current book that I'm working on is a novel that features snake handling. It's set in the 30s in Georgia. And I was just in prepping for today, I was just looking through my old Hemingway review, and here there was an article comparing The Sun Also Rises and Jake's experience of ecstasy watching the bullfights to the writer's experience of becoming a snake handler just today. So he lives on, can't get away from him no matter how hard I try.
Can't get away from him. It makes me think of this moment of the film's release, and why this moment, the release of this film in our time. To borrow one of Hemingway's titles, what does it mean to make an era film like this today, given the stories you've shared, and then also with a broad lens. How do you consider the release of this film? Eric, would you want to start with that question?
Sure. Frankly, I think it's a strange time for Hemingway to be taken up. And I really, the strong critique that Reggie offers has to be part of any conversation that goes on about Hemingway ever after. And it's interesting to me that he talks about academe as a place where Hemingway really has gotten his hooks in. And that was absolutely true for a while. And I'm sure there are places where it's still true, but my experience working on Hemingway when I was in graduate school was that it was already along the lines of Reggie's critique, something that was out of fashion, to say the least, kind of along the lines of putting on a conquistador helmet, inviting all your friends over for Columbus Day. I mean, what are you doing, continuing to add to the scholarship of somebody who has had plenty? So I think an interesting question for me is what happens to Hemingway now in an academy that is definitely feeling the strength of that kind of critique. And I'm really compelled by Toni Morrison's argument that a lot of canonical American literature, formerly canonical American literature, not only excludes many points of view, but is in fact constituted by that exclusion. And I think that's a very powerful thing. Yeah.
Reggie or Ann, anything you'd want to add there?
Yeah, I really would. I think that our students are in the age of FOMA, fear of missing out, and they watch their cell phones in their laps beneath the desk. And it takes a really skilled, I think, professor to open up texts like Hemingway's and show them the experiences that they might share also. All of his characters are fragile and deeply aware of their own death, and yet they're trying to find a way to live in it anyway. And I just find Hemingway to be a writer who has evolved in the most astonishing ways. And I would just reference what we learned about him as he was pushing out, like Santiago, in going farther than he should go, in Garden of Eden, and then in Under Kilimanjaro, where he is trying to shed the whiteness, the celebrity, the weight of all that, and of all of his past sins with animals. And he's trying to to become someone new. And I find that extraordinary. And yeah, I'll just sort of kind of leave it there.
The one other thing I'll say about it, in preparation for this conversation, I surveyed my students this week in class if they had read Hemingway in high school, and boy, they all just lit up, and they were entranced by Hills Like White Elephants and the idea that a writer could so cunningly bury meaning beneath the surface and offer them the experience of finding it. And so when I think about the higher level conversations going on about what a canon is and how to constitute it ethically and in a way that's in communication with a better and better nation and world, that's one thing. But when there's one answer there for what we do with Hemingway. But I feel like as an introduction to some of the complex things that a work of literature can do, despite the fact that it was lost on my high school self, a lot of my students showed more promise at that point and really were just jazzed by that kind of sophistication in subtly weaving themes into a work. Yeah.
Thanks, Eric and Anne. And so thinking about issues of representation, race, gender, colonialism in Hemingway, I think we're getting at this question, do we keep Hemingway around? And if so, what is it about his legacy we would preserve specifically, both in the classroom and in, we're all writers on this panel within our own writing practice, and thinking about the cultural imaginary as well. What would we preserve of Hemingway? Mm-hmm. Reggie, would you want to start that question?
Yeah. If you would have asked me a couple months ago, I would have said throw Hemingway away. But I think now more than ever, it is important for us to take a look at these authors and these works that have been held up in academia. I think that it's been proven just how long Hemingway has been so entrenched in the writing world that long after we die, what is written remains. And what is written doesn't just tell a story about whatever the author was writing about, but it tells the story about what the world was like back then. And it can give insight into why the world is the way it is now. And I think one of the reasons is that we haven't really asked ourselves the question, what does it mean for us to be able to look over his bigotry to appreciate his writing? Does that mean anything? Is that possible? Is that, quote unquote, problematic? Or is it just nuance? Is it the complex nature of human beings? I don't know if I have an answer for that question. I'm still trying to figure it out myself. The more I study, the more I have these types of discussions with other people. My views on Hemingway are just as complex and nuanced and ever-changing as he was. Yeah, I think keeping Hemingway is an everlasting question. And I think currently, I think we need to keep him around, if only to dissect what he wrote.
Let me just jump in a bit. I think the idea of looking at race in Hemingway has been undertreated, and I think that that's being changed. And I just think that makes him even more and more interesting. I was looking through again Under Kilimanjaro, and he said, white people always took the other people's land away from them and just put them on a reservation where they could go to hell and be destroyed as though they were in a concentration camp. So he had that was a different Hemingway than I think we meet in those early stories of the 1920s, where he's a product of his generation. That's 100 years ago, and there wasn't the awareness of and the sensitivity to labeling people, even with characters within a story and using the N-word, and that's awful to read. But I don't think it represented his own heart, because I think he linked the Native American communities and the African American communities linked together in his mind through the idea of white exploitation. And you can find that in his story after story after story, especially in the early Nick Adams stories. So I think the idea of looking at him in terms of race is really, really makes him even more interesting. That's another set of lens. And so it's kudos to Reggie for really foregrounding that. And I noticed on the series of 9 conversations that accompanied the documentary, not one addressed race, not one. Now it might have, I watched them all and took notes, and it might have come in maybe peripherally, but none of them addressed really race, certainly not directly. And that's really something to think about. Yeah.
Well, one thing that's interesting to me, it's hard to overestimate what a huge influence World War II had on writers of that generation. And I was recently reading a book by George Hutchinson that's kind of a literary history of the 1940s. And he talks about how Faulkner's representation of Black characters in the 20s and 30s is offensive in many places. And his post-war work really tries to remediate some of that offensiveness. And so Intruder in the Dust is a different kind of text from things earlier in the century. And I think Ralph Ellison, according to Hutchinson, comments on how the film version of Intruder in the Dust was one of the few representations of Black characters by a white writer that you could show in Harlem after the war and not have it tomatoes thrown at the screen. I mean, it just so Anne can speak to this better than I can, but I feel like Hemingway is a different writer in that post-war climate after the Nagasaki and Hiroshima and Auschwitz. And I do know in the 40s and 50s, there was a real aspiration to represent a kind of universal personhood in any literary work. And whether it was mainly the business of able-bodied, cisgendered white men to capture universal personhood is a really important question.
Very important.
But at least the will was there to get beyond self in a way that it probably even hadn't been as nearly so much before the war.
Yeah, that's a great point. Absolutely, yeah. I'm just.
no,
go ahead.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind responding to this question because I guess I had a thought. I might not respond directly to the panelists who just spoke, but this idea of what is it about his legacy that we would preserve? Why is he still around? And I think part of that for me, as I watched the documentary, I think the reason it's created or it's relevant or it's watched so much is just Hemingway kind of carries this sort of celebrity with him that I feel like a lot of writers just don't have. I've seen Hemingway's face more than any other writer combined with just in history. And I feel like, for lack of a better term, like Hemingway is sexy. And I don't mean that physically, although they say it several times in the documentary. But I mean, I feel like he just kind of grabs people's attention when his face is put somewhere or his writing. He just kind of captures people's attention more than I think most writers are able to do. So I feel like that's part of the reason he sticks around. I don't think that's his only contribution to the literary world, but I do think it has a factor in why he keeps kind of shooting back up when it seems like he might be dying out.
So he's sexier than maybe Faulkner, do you think? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm using that word just because
it's exactly, it's that magnetism. And
right.
It was his curse and his blessing. qualified.
I feel that, charisma will never be a dying virtue. I just feel like people will
Yeah.
always gravitated towards
Yeah.
that part of him.
Yeah. Yeah. And then he fell apart, and then he wasn't the same
Mhm.
at all. Yeah. That's another topic for sure. Yeah.
And how much of that magnetism would you say is constructed in the cultural imaginary, and where does it come from, if so?
So that there's a great book on exactly that by John Rayburn called "Fame Became of Him,"
Okay.
which is a chronicle of Hemingway as a celebrity. And so there were many, many Americans who knew who Hemingway was and thought they had a kind of intimate familiarity with him as a persona without having touched his literature. And it came from movie magazines and Henry Luce publications like Time and Life. Like, he was boosted as a celebrity in addition to having a kind of personal charisma, as Max is talking about it. But I think in addition to the bigotry evident in some of his writing, one of the things I lament most about his celebrity is that it is no longer available to almost any writer. And that means that the great number of voices of color and women writers who have reached larger audiences in the late 20th and early 21st century just don't have the same apparatus of celebrity that Hemingway had. So Jesmond Ward should be as famous as Hemingway, but I bet many more of our viewers have heard of Hemingway than Jesmond Ward, just because how celebrity and publicity relate to literary fame have changed greatly. So I feel like Toni Morrison was kind of the last writer who got as famous as Hemingway.
Yeah.
Might be the only woman of color who gets that kind of fame, since our institutions have really changed.
And yet the life he lived, it was like, did he really go to 3 wars and be, survive 2 African plane crashes just for the press? This things just happened to him. That little bump on his head that you saw through the whole thing, what was that? That wasn't anything done in war. He was at a friend's apartment in Paris, and he was in the John, and he pulled the chain to flush the toilet, and it was the chain that controlled the skylight, and it fell down and hit him on the head and gave him a concussion and 47 stitches. I mean, the guy was just kind of a walking accident, and it all got this sort of press, and he just went with it, and he was seduced to it. There's this one little part in again, I hate to keep referencing Under Kilimanjaro, but he identified truly with the Kamba tribe, and he wanted to look like them. And you'd say that maybe this was really an old man's bad appropriation of another culture, but he really wanted to shed his identity, and he really wanted some kind of scarification that wasn't an accident, that wasn't a wound. And he really, really wanted an ear piercing. And Mary said, "You cannot do that. You cannot, it will ruin your career if you have that ear pierced." And he lost the argument, but he did. He wanted that. So I don't know. He's just somebody who there's just always something more you can say about him, good or bad, beautiful or ugly. Yeah. Why are we all here? Yeah.
Yes, this persona.
Yeah.
And I wonder if we might also talk in terms of influence. So we've spoken of the lore surrounding Hemingway, but when we think of Hemingway's choices as a writer, and I know this overdetermined word of influence is one to pause on, but thinking of Hemingway's place in creative writing, for example, how do you conceptualize that place today, and in conjunction with what we've been talking about around Hemingway's, how Hemingway is inherited in this moment? Eric, would you want to start that one, since I know that's the subject of your research in many ways?
Yeah. Well, I think you can explain the whole body of fiction that was published in the 70s and 80s, the kind of American minimalism of Raymond Carver and Frederick Bartholomew and Ann Beattie and Amy Hempel. It's kind of post-Hemingway school. And these were writers who, for the first time, were trained in creative writing workshops. And from those workshops, they learned to eschew adverbs, write simple subject, verb to object sentences, choose metaphor from the range of experience of the characters represented, go with the declarative and taught in simple words rather than Latinate and words and complex formulations. And they were students who had studied with teachers in the first workshops, which were very much a GI Bill kind of phenomenon. So guys who got out of service in World War II went to workshops at Iowa and Stanford, studied with writers like Wallace Stegner and Vance Burgeli, who were amenable to this kind of aesthetic, then went on to teach students, and students far distant from the theaters of war in the first half of the century, and far distant even from big game hunting or deep sea fishing, found ways to make use of his techniques. And that trend, as a trend or as a kind of coherent body of writers, seems to be passing, but you still sense a lot of Hemingway's influence on style and also on workshop pedagogy late in the 20th century, I think, or at least I do when I look at handbooks on craft. You can still see a lot in there from him.
I think what's ironic is that if an aspiring writer were to ask Hemingway how they could best develop as a writer, the last thing he would say is join a workshop. In his Nobel speech, he just said, "The writer's life is lonely." And I'm just quoting here, writing groups palliate the writer's loneliness, but rarely do they improve the writing. So I think Hemingway would love to undercut all that and say, read. And, in the finca, in the inside, the entire house is a library, 9,000 books, all with marginalia. And he would just say, read, that is your teacher. Read everything. And he did. He was so incredibly eclectic in his choices. So it's an ironic thing that's happened. But I agree with you, Eric, that, and I did read The Craft in a New World this week, and I thought, whoa, yeah. And I love the way it's all of this is being deconstructed now, and that just seems to be something that will open up voices that have felt tamped down, if not silenced. Well, that's great.
So Carrie in the chat just asked, is this live or pre-recorded? And the answer is it's live. And I wanted to digress to respond to her chat. She said, I found abhorrent his hunting for sport, cruel, excessive, selfish, and privileged. And I'm going to leave it to one of my fellow panelists to defend big game hunting, because I just can't. I agree with you, Carrie. Thank you for that comment.
Okay. No, I wouldn't defend it in the slightest. All I will say is that there was 20 years between his first safari and his second. And when he went back the second time, he said, I can no longer shoot animals for trophy. If I have to shoot it for meat, or because he was a game warden, because the animal is causing destruction to people's huts or their livestock, okay, but he could no longer shoot animals to put on the wall. So it is awful. Although we have to remember that in the short life of Francis Macomber, he has an amazing, as you remember, from the point of view of the wounded lion. And so, but he could no longer do that. He could not do that. And I think we have to sort of reread him a bit on that. Yeah.
So also in the chat, Spencer asks if Hemingway has anything to offer Amanda Gorman, who read at the inauguration. And
Oh, what a great question. Wow.
I don't know.
I don't
think that question might have come in at the moment when we were talking about celebrity. And Eric, I think you said that Toni Morrison was the last author to see that kind of celebrity, and then Amanda Gorman might come to mind as perhaps having that kind of celebrity.
I stand corrected by Spencer. Thank you, Spencer. Yeah.
I will say, as a spoken word poet, I think that is starting to bring the literary world back into celebrity status. Just recently, a spoken word artist from Stockton, California, won America's Got Talent. So it's things like that are, and then when you have, you know, a young Black spoken word poet speaking at the inauguration, it does say something not only about what value we're putting into the literary world, but who we're putting that value in. Because in both instances, it was young Black people that were awarded. And I think that especially through spoken word poetry, which is historically and continues to be driven by queer, Black, trans voices, the popularity of that art form is really shifting what is acceptable in the literary world and what stories and what narratives and what perspectives are being expressed. I mean, you can get on YouTube and look at button poetry and Right About Now and Bay Poets Unite and see poems from a complete, like, colorful wheel of diverse voices with unique perspectives and experiences on a myriad of topics. And it really does change your point of view and give you an insight about how somebody else experiences the world. So I think that, I think writing is starting to become, maybe not like I'm going to get rich, but it's definitely becoming influential.
That's great.
Reggie, would you want to say anything about the workshops you've been hosting in conjunction with the KEET programming?
Yes, I did one workshop with KEET a couple weeks ago. It was on race and Hemingway. So we took a few quotes from Hemingway, deconstructed them, specifically in terms of, you know, iceberg theory and including the details that matter and being very specific and intentional, and using as little words as possible to create these big images and really immerse you in this world. What does it mean when racism is a tool in order to build that world? So like a quote from The Battler is, I don't even think it needs context. It's just so self-explanatory, crouching on long inward legs. And to me, I have to hold two truths. That is an incredibly offensive description, and it paints an incredibly specific image in my mind. It did exactly what he wanted it to do. And so when you see quotes like that, from this prolific American writer and someone who, like, historically, even though he's kind of fading out of academia, fading in and out, but historically has been a huge part of our curriculum. What does that mean when we're presenting these works to students of color? Specifically, you know, I know plenty of students that don't feel comfortable having these discussions in classrooms. And what what does that mean when we are creating barriers for people who have already hopped over so many barriers to get just so little? And I don't think that it's fair that academia hasn't responsibly presented curriculum on Hemingway in the context of race. Like Ann said, the panels that came out with this discussion, none of them mentioned race directly. And what does that mean when Hemingway mentions race directly? And we decide to skip over it to the point where some people even forget that it happens. And what does that mean what does that mean about what we view the world as? If we can skip over Hemingway's racism, does that mean that we believe that Black people are skippable? And that Black issues and Black struggles are something that we can overlook if there is something that we consider valuable inside of that racism? So it poses a lot of questions, not just about Hemingway, but about what we find acceptable as a society and what we're willing to overlook and ignore for the sake of iceberg theory or these really descriptive images. Yeah, I think that's what I'm really sitting at with race and Hemingway.
Okay. Absolutely.
Well, I kind of want to put Max on the spot. Max, I don't know like how much control you have over curriculum when you choose works of literature to teach students, but you're really close to this question for students at a really formative age. And how much are you teaching them works that reflect their own experiences? How much are you celebrating styles of the past that may come with baggage?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will first by saying that my curriculum is mostly chosen. The works are kind of laid out exactly what we need to teach. I actually I really like the curriculum that's been given to us because it does offer sort of perspectives that align with my students directly. And then there are some that sort of challenge them in some ways. We're reading about right now, it's not too relevant to this, but Jamestown and sort of the founding of it. We read a novel, it's called Blood on the River. It follows like John Smith and the English settlers. So it's like a very complex issue, but I think we've sort of enjoyed talking about it because it is it's part of history, and it's not something that, is super comfortable to talk about. But I think in line with this idea of like Hemingway or bringing these texts that have that kind of baggage or sort of negative weight to them, I think for me, I do like to bring those in some ways and sort of expose students. I don't want to hide them. I don't want to force them, but I do want to kind of make them aware of the world and what's out there, but in a way that they can access it and they get something out of it and learn something.
And Eric and Ann, since you're both in the classroom as well, Ann, I know less often nowadays now that you're writing more full time, but maybe turning Eric's question back to the university setting as well.
Meaning choosing texts for students, yeah. I will say that I tend to teach both the early part and the later part of the 20th century into the 21st. And so in a course that stops by the 60s or the 50s, it requires a different kind of work putting together a good syllabus than a course that runs from the 60s through the present. And whenever I do the latter, whenever I teach recent stuff, it's just so easy to populate the syllabus with all kinds of people because they're really, since the 90s, has just been an efflorescence in excellent work by every kind of American. I mean, if you're teaching American literature, when you teach the early part of the century, there's much that's available, and it constitutes a kind of alternative canon to what was taught for a long time. And so it's a different kind of embarrassment of riches, but often one will have to sacrifice Fitzgerald or Faulkner or Hemingway in order to give a fuller picture of work by Black authors in the 20s or 30s or 40s, or female voices, or Marxist writers who were profoundly decanonized. I like teaching Grace Lumpkin's kind of proletariat novel, To Make My Bread, which is a very different kind of work from what was canonized in the 40s and 50s. And it's entirely along lines of political ideology and also gender. It's hard to, decide what to teach in 14 weeks from the first half of the century, feeling the weight of that white male canon and admiring a great deal about it, but then also doing the exciting work of resuscitating other voices that have been on the syllabus for less time.
There's only so many slices to the pie. You can't, only so many weeks. Yeah.
Thank you. And before we get to Denny's question about what is iceberg theory, which I think is a lovely question, thank you. And Carrie and everyone who has written in the chat will come to your questions very soon. Reggie, I wonder if you wanted to take up that question at all, and also building on what has been said and the lens of race, if there are additional passages you'd want to take us to think about that lens further.
Yeah, I think first, to answer the question, what is iceberg theory? It's a specific style of minimalism that focus kind of on the surface elements without kind of explicitly discussing what's going on under the surface. So it kind of forces you to dig deeper contextually to really think about the implications of what's going on. It's really important. I guess for me, it's important to keep that in mind when I'm looking at Hemingway and race, because he does leave interpretations up for like what he views or how he views Black Americans and people of African descent in general. I'm just thinking of some of the passages specifically from the Battler. The only way I can describe the way he describes Black people is animalistic. Like I said earlier, crouching on long inward legs over a fire. Another passage is in a low, smooth, polite inward voice, or Nick knew from the way he walked that he was a Negro. These are all things that kind of scream less than human. And even in more sympathetic works like Islands in the Stream, you see they were Negroes, filthy, scaly with age and dirt. And that word scaly says something to me, because I think that for Hemingway, word choice did matter. I think that these passages show that even, I think at the time, and I see this a lot in history and anecdotes and writing, that even in a sympathetic or even empathetic context, white writers have always suggested in very subtle ways that while the Black plight is sympathetic, Black people are still inferior. So there's not that equality. It's just kind of like, you don't deserve to be where I'm at, but you don't deserve what's going on with what's going on to you. So it's kind of, there's a superiority complex that I think that is, it's very hard to shake, especially like during the time period, just in the context of white supremacy in America, implicit bias, all of the things that we have the words for now weren't even being begun to be talked about. And so it's kind of hard to break out of that when you don't have the language to identify it. So I guess that is a concession I will make about Hemingway, is that it's kind of hard not to be racist when you don't have the words or the experiences or the education that tells you otherwise. Even when you do try, there's no system to help you avoid making mistakes.
Thanks, Reggie. The question of historicism is where you left off in those brilliant comments, and thank you for bringing us to the passages themselves, the close reading that you offer. Anne, I wonder if you would want to say anything about what it means to read Anne. I want to always read Anne, to read Hemingway in his historical context.
I think you on our little script here, the idea of the specific detail as is particular to Hemingway. I've always felt that one of the prime goals of Hemingway constructing his pieces has been that perception for him has a moral quality to it. Again, I keep referring to Under Kilimanjaro because I reread it most recently. He says, "This looking and not seeing is a great sin. We do not deserve to live in a world if we did not see it." And he's referring to the birds around the camp. And most of all is to really see them and not look past them. And so he always talked about seeing things with first chastity of sight, seeing right with your eyes. That assuming a whole bunch of things, but that is what he talked about so often. He talked about, again, with the iceberg, knowing aside from what you really thought or were told you should feel, what was it that you really saw that created the emotion? And then this is all in Death in the Afternoon, and he gives the example of a bullfight that he saw, and he was profoundly disturbed by it, and he lay in bed at night wondering what it was. What was it that was so disturbing? And he finally got it, and it was an image. And it was the image of the matador who'd been gored, and his clothes had been slit from the thigh bone to his knee. And he said it was the contrast of the dirty, rented underwear to the unbelievably white of the thigh bone. And he said it was that was so shocking to him that he finally got the emotion. And then he felt that's what you give the reader. You give them that sequence of motion and fact, and then you never state the emotion. And that's, of course, is part of the iceberg too. And I know I mentioned this little fun thing to me when we were kind of doing our little dress rehearsal about the debate between Frank McCourt and Mary Gordon, Two-Hearted River, and they were arguing over what Nick Adams ate for dinner, what meal he fixed for himself. And Mary said it was spaghetti and Frank said it was beans, and they were arguing back and forth very, very vehemently. And of course it was both the spaghetti and the beans. But I think we who read that story can see the bubbling up as he's heating it in a pan, and we can taste the apricot juice and the onion sandwiches. And he has just a way of evoking real things. And I know that maybe Reggie and I will be talking a little bit more about the battler later, but the last image in that story is Nick is in shock and he's walking away and he notices that he has a ham sandwich in his hand. He has no memory of it being given to him by bugs. And I'll just say one more little thing. I was teaching Hemingway a long time ago to a fairly young class, and one of my students came down with leukemia at the beginning of the term. And by the time it came to be spring, she died. And so I read this. You expected to be sad in the fall. Part of you died each year when the leaves fell from the trees and the branches were bare against the wind and the cold wintry light. But you knew there would always be the spring. When the cold rains kept on and killed the spring, it was as though a young person had died for no reason. And I think that's the kind of language that keeps me going with Hemingway, although he's incredibly complicated, isn't he? And fraught, for sure. Yeah.
That kind of emotional resonance lasts. So thank you for sharing that, Ann. I want to open it up to the audience. If there are questions that haven't been asked yet, please send them our way. And as we wait for questions to come in, Reggie and Ann, if there is more you wanted to say about the battler and the works that you have named so far, please jump in. I know we haven't had a chance to really talk about U.S. imperialism, the portrayal of Cuba, a number of topics and lenses that we could take up. We briefly touched on the ecological lens with the response to the question on hunting, but any lenses you'd want to bring to the work, please.
Yeah. Do you want to go around on the battler a little bit more? Do we want to lay that to rest, Reggie?
Let's lay that to rest. I have been talking about the battler for like the last 3 weeks.
Okay.
Just in the breach, I will mention I'm not a huge fan of The Old Man and the Sea, but my favorite sentence in it is when Hemingway describes the Portuguese man of war. So The Old Man and the Sea is really true to its setting. And there's not a lot of variety in the landscape because it's a guy on a boat in the ocean and you hear about the clouds and you hear about the water. But there's this one moment when this sea creature emerges on the surface of the water, and in a way that's totally untypical of Hemingway, he piles up 5 adjectives all at once. And it feels like a huge event. You hear gelatinous, you hear yellow, I can't remember the other 3, but that this thing comes to the surface. And it captures what it must feel like to be on a boat for hours and hours and see nothing. And then suddenly you see something.
Yeah.
And by being so economical in all the words he chooses, and then suddenly just spitting out 5 of them in a row, it emulates that experience of seeing the Portuguese man of war. And I think it's, the coolest thing in the book.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I just might add that I think one of the threads that is increasing in Hemingway scholarship is his multiculturalism. And we could define that all sorts of ways, but he lived in 4 different countries and he set novels in 6 different countries as well. And so there is that. I heard Derek Walcott at a Hemingway conference in Bimini give a talk on Hemingway's influence on him as a writer. And to illustrate, he took some, I forget now what the book was, but he lined it out and read it as poetry. And he said, he's a poet. Hemingway is a poet. And Walcott, along with Ellison, and we've talked about that, said that Hemingway was where he felt at home, and that he gave the feeling beyond tragedy was as close to the blues as anything in American literature. And so just have to think about, he spoke in some way to other races, probably not knowing it, probably not knowing it. But that's such an interesting topic, though. It's just, and it's so neglected. But here we are anyway. Yeah.
I have a quote here by Derek Walcott. He says, Hemingway's prose possesses an aura of an echo, something incantatory, almost sacred, a vibration close to prayer, a ritual, a veneration that creates that echo that is in Hemingway's style. That's from Derek Walcott's essay, Hemingway in the Caribbean. It's the epigraph for this book.
Great.
There's something I think that captures so much of the sonic quality that Hemingway brings to his style and prose, speaking to what you just said, Anne, of poetry in the prose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
well, I think we might have scared Carrie away by not coming down hard enough on big game hunting.
Oh, let's come down really hard on big game hunting. We could speak to Trump's children and the pictures that they. Never mind. I didn't see.
Oh, well, last call for the audience questions. If you have any, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. And I'll begin my thanks here. It's just been wonderful to work with this group of people. Thank you so much for this conversation and for your explication of Hemingway's work and taking this occasion of a film to dive into the complexities. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If there aren't additional questions, I'll go ahead and close us out for tonight with much gratitude again. And thanks again to KEET-TV and Katie Whiteside and David Thompson for facilitating this space behind the scenes. Thanks to all of our panelists, and thank you all, those who came to this event. We really appreciate your participation.
Okay. Thank you.